Doubts how WhatsApp murdered the $100 billion SMS industry overnight. Picture this. It's 2008, and telecommunication companies are sitting on top of the world's most profitable racket. They're charging customers 25 cents to send a 160-character text message that costs them literally 3/1000ths of a penny to transmit. That's a markup of over 8,000%. The global SMS industry is pulling in over $100 billion annually, making it more profitable per byte than sending data to Mars. Carriers like Verizon, AT&T, and Vodafone are laughing all the way to the bank, treating text messaging like digital gold. But in a small office in Mountain View, California, two former Yahoo engineers named Brian Acton and Jan Koum are about to detonate a nuclear bomb that will obliterate this entire industry in less than 6 years. Their weapon of choice? A simple messaging app called WhatsApp that would grow to handle more messages in a single day than the entire global SMS network handled in a year at its peak. This is the story of how 55 employees armed with nothing but smartphones and Wi-Fi connections systematically destroyed one of the most lucrative industries in telecommunications history, turning a $100 billion cash cow into worthless digital dust overnight. The SMS industry in 2008 was the telecom equivalent of printing money in your basement, except it was completely legal and governments actually helped enforce the monopoly. Text messaging had been around since 1992, but by 2008, it had become the ultimate example of artificial scarcity, creating obscene profits. Here's how the scam worked. SMS messages piggybacked on control channels that cellular towers used anyway to maintain connections with phones. These control channels existed whether anyone sent texts or not, meaning the actual cost to carriers for transmitting a text message was essentially zero. Yet somehow, these companies convinced the entire world that sending, "Hey, what's up?" should cost a quarter. The math was so absurd it bordered on criminal. A text message is 160 bytes of data. At 25 cents per message, that works out to about $1,500 per megabyte. To put that in perspective, it was cheaper to send data to the Hubble Space Telescope than to text your friend about dinner plans. Globally, people were sending over 8 trillion SMS messages per year, generating revenues of over $100 billion annually for carriers. The profit margins were so fat that SMS revenues often represented 20 to 40% of a carrier's total revenue, despite using virtually no network resources. It was the greatest profit extraction scheme in telecommunications history, and it was about to meet its match in two guys who got rejected by Facebook for jobs. Brian Acton and Jan Koum weren't your typical Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. They were immigrants who understood the value of cheap communication better than most. Koum had fled Soviet-controlled Ukraine with his mother when he was 16, living in a small apartment in Mountain View where they survived on food stamps and government assistance. Acton was a straightforward engineer who valued privacy and hated advertising with a passion that bordered on religious fervor. Both had spent years at Yahoo, watching the company slowly lose its way in a maze of corporate bureaucracy and advertising-driven decisions. In 2007, they both left Yahoo and applied to work at Facebook and Twitter. Both companies rejected them. Facebook's rejection was particularly brutal. Acton tweeted about it, saying, "Facebook turned me down. It was a great opportunity to connect with some fantastic people. Looking forward to life's next adventure." That tweet would later become legendary when Facebook paid $19 billion to acquire the company Acton would co-found just 2 years later. After their rejections, the two friends decided to build something themselves. They wanted to create a simple, clean messaging service that worked across all smartphones without the carrier's ridiculous per-message charges. In February 2009, Koum incorporated WhatsApp Inc. The name came from the phrase, "What's up?" and it represented everything the SMS industry wasn't: simple, affordable, and designed for users instead of shareholders. The first version of WhatsApp launched in June 2009 and was basically a flop. It wasn't even a messaging app yet, just a glorified status update service that let people broadcast what they were doing. Downloads were terrible, user engagement was non-existent, and Koum was getting ready to give up and look for another job. But then Apple released push notifications with iOS 3.0 in June 2009, and everything changed. Telecom immediately realized that push notifications could turn smartphones into real-time messaging devices that worked over data connections instead of SMS. Within weeks, he rebuilt WhatsApp from scratch as a messaging platform. The concept was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of paying carriers 25 cents per message, users could send unlimited messages over their existing data plans or Wi-Fi connections for essentially free. The app charged just 99 cents per year after a free trial, making it practically free compared to SMS pricing. More importantly, WhatsApp messages weren't limited to 160 characters. Users could send longer messages, photos, videos, and later voice messages and documents. The value proposition was so obvious, it was almost insulting to the intelligence of anyone still paying for SMS. By August 2009, WhatsApp 2.0 launched with real messaging capabilities, and downloads immediately started climbing. Users weren't just downloading the app, they were evangelizing it to their friends and family like they'd discovered fire. Word of mouth spread like wildfire, because everyone who used WhatsApp could immediately see how much money they were saving compared to SMS. While WhatsApp was gaining traction with early adopters, the telecommunications industry was in complete denial about the threat. Carrier executives dismissed messaging apps as niche products that would never appeal to mainstream users. They pointed to the fact that SMS was built into every phone, required no downloads, and worked without internet connections as proof that their dominance was unshakable. These arguments seemed reasonable in 2009, when smartphones represented less than 20% of mobile phones and data plans were expensive and unreliable. But carriers fundamentally misunderstood how quickly the mobile landscape was shifting. Smartphone adoption was following an exponential curve, not the linear progression that telecom analysts predicted. Data plans were getting cheaper and more reliable every quarter. Wi-Fi was becoming ubiquitous in homes, offices, and public spaces. Most critically, users were becoming increasingly sophisticated about understanding the real costs of their mobile services. Young people especially began to view SMS charges as a scam perpetrated by greedy corporations. WhatsApp's growth reflected this shift in user behavior. By December 2009, WhatsApp was processing over 500,000 messages per day. By June 2010, that number had grown to 100 million messages per day. The growth wasn't just happening in tech-savvy markets like Silicon Valley. WhatsApp was exploding in countries where SMS charges were even more oppressive relative to local incomes. In India, Brazil, Mexico, and throughout Europe, users were abandoning SMS en masse in favor of WhatsApp. The app was particularly popular among immigrant communities who needed to communicate internationally, where SMS charges were even more predatory. The tipping point came in 2011 when three things happened simultaneously. Smartphone penetration crossed 50% in major markets, data plans became unlimited or very cheap, and WhatsApp reached critical mass in terms of network effects. Network effects are the phenomenon where a product becomes more valuable as more people use it. WhatsApp hit the sweet spot where most people's friends and family were already on the platform, eliminating the main friction that prevented messaging app adoption. By 2011, WhatsApp was processing over 1 billion messages per day, and the growth rate was accelerating, not slowing down. The user experience was also dramatically superior to SMS in every measurable way. WhatsApp messages were delivered instantly over data connections, while SMS messages could be delayed by minutes or hours during peak usage times. WhatsApp showed delivery confirmations and read receipts, while SMS provided no feedback about message status. WhatsApp supported group messaging for up to 100 participants, while SMS group messages were a confusing mess of separate threads. WhatsApp worked seamlessly across different carriers and countries, while SMS was subject to various compatibility issues and international roaming charges that could cost several dollars per message. Perhaps most importantly, WhatsApp just felt modern and efficient, while SMS felt increasingly antiquated and clunky. The user experience gap was so wide that once people switched to WhatsApp, they almost never went back to SMS for anything other than two-factor authentication codes and automated messages from businesses. By 2012, the massacre was in full swing, and carrier executives were finally starting to panic. WhatsApp was processing over 10 billion messages per day, which meant it was already handling more daily message volume than most national SMS networks. The financial impact was becoming impossible to ignore. In markets where WhatsApp had high penetration, SMS revenues were falling off a cliff. Spanish carrier Telefonica reported that SMS revenues dropped 20% in a single year. French carrier Orange saw SMS volumes decline by over 30%. These weren't gradual shifts that carriers could adapt to over time. These were sudden, dramatic revenue collapses that threatened the fundamental business model of wireless telecommunications. Desperate carriers tried various strategies to stop the bleeding. Some blocked or throttled messaging apps on their networks, but this just made customers angrier and more likely to switch carriers. Others tried to launch their own messaging apps, but these efforts failed spectacularly because carriers had no credibility with users when it came to messaging services. A few carriers tried to partner with existing messaging apps, but the economics didn't work because messaging apps could operate profitably at price points that were 99% below SMS pricing. The most desperate carriers lobbied governments to regulate messaging apps like telecommunications services, but regulators generally sided with consumers who were clearly benefiting from lower prices and better services. Every strategy carriers tried failed because they were fighting against basic economics and user preferences, not just a single competitor. The final nail in the coffin came between 2013 and 2014, when WhatsApp's growth became truly exponential and started affecting carriers in wealthy markets like the United States and Western Europe, not just developing countries. In February 2013, WhatsApp announced it was processing over 50 billion messages per day. To put that number in perspective, that was more messages than the entire global SMS network handled per day at its peak. By April 2014, WhatsApp reached 500 million monthly active users and was processing over 64 billion messages per day, plus 700 million photos and 100 million voice messages. The service had become so central to global communications that WhatsApp outages made international news and caused panic in countries where the app had replaced SMS entirely. Meanwhile, SMS revenues were collapsing everywhere. WhatsApp had significant market share. In Spain, SMS volumes dropped by over 40% between 2011 and 2013. In the Netherlands, SMS revenues fell by 50% in just 2 years. Even in the United States, where carriers had fought harder to maintain SMS pricing, revenues from text messaging peaked in 2012 and began declining rapidly. Industry analysts estimated that messaging apps like WhatsApp were costing carriers over $20 billion annually in lost SMS revenues by 2013, and the losses were accelerating. The most devastating statistic was that WhatsApp users sent an average of 30 messages per day, compared to just 6 SMS messages per day for the average mobile subscriber. This meant that WhatsApp wasn't just cheaper, it was actually encouraging more communication, which made the carrier revenue losses even more dramatic. Facebook's acquisition of WhatsApp in February 2014 for $19 billion marked the official end of the SMS era and validated everything that Telecom and Acton had built. The acquisition price seemed insane to many observers, but it actually made perfect sense when viewed as the cost of buying the weapon that had destroyed a $100 billion industry. At the time of the acquisition, WhatsApp had 450 million monthly active users, sending 64 billion messages per day, making it larger than the entire SMS ecosystem. More importantly, WhatsApp was still growing rapidly and had barely scratched the surface in terms of monetization. The app was generating only about $20 million in annual revenue from its 99-cent subscription fees, but it was replacing SMS services that had generated over $100 billion annually for carriers. Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg understood that WhatsApp represented a fundamental shift in how people communicated, and that controlling that shift was worth almost any price. The acquisition also validated the broader trend toward messaging apps that offered superior experiences at dramatically lower prices. Apps like WeChat in China, Line in Japan, and Telegram globally were all following similar trajectories, collectively destroying SMS revenues across every major market. The SMS industry's response to Facebook's WhatsApp acquisition was essentially to surrender. Major carriers began shifting their messaging strategies toward rich communication services that tried to replicate messaging app features within SMS, but these efforts were too little, too late. Users had already moved on, and there was no going back. By 2015, the annihilation was complete. WhatsApp had grown to over 900 million monthly active users, processing over 100 billion messages per day, making it the largest messaging platform in human history. The global SMS industry, which had generated over $100 billion in 2012, had shrunk to less than $70 billion and was declining rapidly every quarter. In markets where WhatsApp dominated, SMS had become essentially irrelevant, except for automated messages from businesses and two-factor authentication. Young people in particular had completely abandoned SMS. Surveys showed that users under 25 were sending less than one SMS per week on average, compared to over 50 WhatsApp messages per day. The economic destruction was unprecedented in telecommunications history. Carriers had built their business models around SMS, being a high-margin cash cow that could subsidize network investments and device subsidies. When SMS revenues collapsed, carriers were forced to raise prices on other services, eliminate device subsidies, and reduce network investment. The ripple effects extended throughout the entire mobile ecosystem. Device manufacturers could no longer rely on carrier subsidies, leading to changes in phone pricing and financing models. Mobile virtual network operators that had relied on SMS arbitrage opportunities went out of business. Even companies that provided SMS infrastructure and billing systems were forced to pivot or shut down. A single messaging app with 55 employees had systematically destroyed an industry that employed hundreds of thousands of people and generated more revenue than the GDP of most countries. The WhatsApp revolution represents one of the most dramatic examples of technological disruption in business history, but it also illustrates fundamental principles about how industries become vulnerable to disruption. The SMS industry's downfall wasn't caused by superior technology alone. It was caused by a combination of artificial scarcity pricing, user experience neglect, and stubborn resistance to change that made disruption inevitable. Carriers had become so accustomed to extracting maximum profits from captive customers that they forgot about delivering value. When smartphones and data networks made alternative solutions possible, users abandoned SMS with a speed and decisiveness that reflected years of accumulated frustration with predatory pricing. WhatsApp succeeded because it aligned perfectly with user needs and preferences, while carriers remained focused on protecting profit margins instead of serving customers. The company's simple philosophy of building a great product at a fair price proved more powerful than decades of carrier market dominance and regulatory protection. Today, WhatsApp handles over 100 billion messages per day for over 2 billion users worldwide, while SMS has been relegated to a legacy service used primarily for automated notifications. The lesson for other industries is clear. When your business model depends on artificial scarcity and captive customers, you're not building a sustainable competitive advantage. You're creating an opportunity for someone else to build a better solution and steal your entire market overnight. WhatsApp didn't just compete with SMS. It made SMS irrelevant so quickly that most users don't even remember when text messaging cost 25 cents per message. That's the mark of a true industry killshot.